We're going to be appointing very pro-crime judges. Michigan gave us Motang.
And you know, when you say per capita, there's many per capitas. It's like per capita relative to what?
Action replays in magnified fortune. To me, Corona means Italy. The Burmese executives. So this Burmese, they say, pronounce it Burmese. Hydrosonic, I go in super duper. Illegal, look. Free health care for illegal, look. When they gaze upon Yosemites.
All right. Everybody hit that like. We're about to get started. Share the show. Annoy the maggot in your life by sharing the show out. The chat room. There we are. People starting to gather. It's good. Hello, Steph heads. We're going to be up in like 1 minute, 60 seconds. You got a shorter window to share this morning than you normally do. All right, let's do this right away. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. It's HAL Sparks Mornings Mega Worldwide. Like, subscribe, give a thumbs up, support the show, etc., etc., etc. I apologize that there was no news this weekend, and there will be no news all week long. Obviously, we're in a desert, a graveyard of news stories. There's nothing really happening in the world, so I'll be tap dancing most of the week. We have some amazing guests this morning. Thanks, Andrea. And the first up, let me bring her in, is CHIC Canfora, who is joining me right now. Hi, welcome to the show. It's your first time here. I can't say how grateful I am that you could join us. And for those that don't know, she was injured at Kent State during the shooting years ago, and is kind of an important witness to not only that period in time, but its parallels right now. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. How are you this fine morning? What's your week been like?
Well, it's been a busy week, but an enlightening one as well. While I wasn't physically injured on May 4th, 1970, my brother was one of the 9 wounded.
Gotcha.
His roommate, Tom Grace, my best friend, was also wounded, along with 7 others and 4 that were killed. But I was an eyewitness and survivor of the shootings, and the parallels to Kent State and the Kent State massacre, to what is happening on the streets of our cities, including LA, are striking. And I'm so glad that you thought to have me talk about today, about those parallels and why we should all be watching what's happening in our cities so closely.
Yeah, so we were talking a little bit before the show. It's why I wanted to jump right in and have this conversation with you on the air about the use of propaganda, both leading up to what happened at Kent State and I would say active and passive propaganda, which I think, we went through a period of very active propaganda, almost colloquially adorable stuff like buy war bonds kind of stuff around World War II. And then there's playing this real role of passive propaganda and this like war of words that happened all during the civil rights movement between the authorities and revolutionaries and the like, and everybody in between. And it became a mix where people didn't quite know what to believe at any given time. It was sort of the first attack on truth that we really saw during that period of time. And do you think that led up to what we saw at Kent State and this kind of the rising fever around, seeing your fellow citizens as other.
Well, without question, the Nixon administration was as smart as the Trump administration, not only in the way that they lied to the American public about the war in Vietnam, just as even those before them, the Johnson administration included. But the inflammatory rhetoric that fueled the Kent State massacre is very much alive again. We hear it in the voices of Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, Pam Bondi, others. Of course, with the help of OAN and Fox News, these propagandists just traffic every single day in the same kind of politics of fear. They repeatedly dehumanize immigrants the same way that Nixon dehumanized student protesters. He called us bums. He likened us to Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan and Hitler's brown shirts. The Governor Rhodes then echoed their sentiment and called us 18 and 19-year-old kids at Kent State the worst type of people we harbor in America, before sending in armed National Guard troops to see us not just as an enemy, but to see us with targets on our backs.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a lot of historical changes made after Kent State. I think that did tamp down both the understanding of where that rhetoric goes and the actions, what National Guard gear, what gear they can bring, what their rules of engagement are. Went through a drastic shift at it. It did have an impact. And I feel like Donald Trump is trying to undo that impact. And he doesn't seem to be succeeding so far, thank God, that it's been very limited, certainly not to the degree we've seen at Kent State. But I'm of the impression that he can't wag the dog outside the country because he planned to get rid of all the wars in the world. So he has to wag the dog on American soil. And so that's what his attempt is leading up to. And so was there an element of that, like the Vietnam War was going on at the time? It's not like they could start a Grenada situation like, Bush 1 or something like that, or Reagan, to distract from their problems. So they had to bring it home. They had to use, the enemy within conversation.
Right. Well, polarization is the key. If they divide us against one another, then we're not talking about the real enemy here. We see each other as the target of our discontent. The soldiers that are called out right now to face ICE protesters are just like the guardsmen who did not see us as human 55 years ago because of the inflammatory rhetoric. They're forgetting that most of us, the ICE agents and those thugs that they're sending out to square off with protesters, are forgetting that most of us are children and grandchildren of immigrants, of those who came here to seek freedom. The Trump administration, all of them, they're poisoning public discourse by branding all asylum seekers and migrant workers as rapists and criminals. And they did that before the midterm elections. Nixon did that, it was in the 60s, it was gays against straights, the frat boys on campus against the hippies on campus, and the real irony is the man leading the dehumanization of our immigrant population is himself a rapist and convicted felon,
right?
Who, is a master at convincing people that the caravans are coming that mysteriously disappear the day after the midterms, because he knows it works with that base that just perpetuates the myths of danger of anybody who looks, thinks, loves, lives differently from themselves.
Well, they, and again, we have a president in this situation where it used to be a very clear us versus them. There was sort of this conservative ideal against this kind of liberal ideal, and they were butting heads all the time that, the liberals were full of hippies and the conservatives were all buttoned down. I would argue that Trump himself is an anomaly amongst all those people. It's why he's creating a rift in his own party. His us versus them stuff can never, once you let that genie out of the bottle, you really can't get it back in. And I think that's where, conservatives and liberals, often will seek comedy in politics to bring the temperature down, because they recognize that once this starts to roll, it can get really ugly really fast. And Trump himself seems incapable of understanding that, maybe because when you boil it down to it, nobody really is on his side. The man has no friends. He's got transactional relationships everywhere, right? Nobody, even his wife can't stand him. And his parade was a flop this weekend. So it's slowly dawning on him that, maybe moneyed interests are the only people. He rolled back some of his immigrant talk this weekend. We saw about he told ICE to stop doing raids at hotels, obviously, and places where hospitality workers who work undocumented under the table, like Mar-a-Lago, like Doral, like Bedminster, all of his sites have hired undocumented workers for years. His tower is built with Chinese steel. The man is a forceful hypocrite in these areas. And for all this, they're rapists and murderers. His wanton disregard for human life and the rules of engagement of war, and the idea that he's a convicted, adjudicated rapist, is lost on no one at this point. The question is that what did you see as the like post Kent, the shock of the nation? Did you see sort of a mindset shift after it had happened, or was it, what did the fight between those two sides continue, as excuse and vilification for a period of time after that, or because it was a very stunning moment on American soil. And I think a lot of people reacted to it as such. But in the temperature afterwards, what did you see and feel?
Well, certainly it was a chilling moment for the world. It was a moment that shocked the American conscience, that American soldiers would turn their guns on American people. And Kent State still is the day that our constitutional right to freedom of speech and assembly was put to one of its greatest tests. But, the understanding that what the Guardsmen did was unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable, which is what Nixon's own Commission on Campus Unrest found months and months later. In the immediate aftermath, we got hate mail, we got bomb threats. It was frightening to go home to Barberton, Ohio, to a very conservative neighborhood, to an aunt that stormed into our kitchen while my brother was still bandaged from his gunshot wound and was screaming, there was a sniper. You kids had no business being out there. And it has still taken us 55 years to get to the truth of why, on a sunny day in May, during a peaceful legal protest against the war in Vietnam, a handful of soldiers didn't just lift their weapons and look through the scopes of those rifles, but they pulled those triggers and continued pulling those triggers, shooting at the bodies of 18 and 19-year-old college students, and doing so with such an intent to kill that a major had to beat some of them over the head, over their helmets, with a baton to get them to stop shooting. Until a National Guardsman joins us in the 55 years that we have spent trying to tell people the truth of what happened that day, until one of those triggermen actually grows a conscience and stands with us, I'm past wanting vengeance or justice for the heinous thing they did. I just want the truth. Because unless we know what compels a soldier to turn his guns on his own citizens, we will never learn the right lessons from Kent State. And so I'm doing it today. I repeatedly make an appeal for a National Guardsman to join us and help us understand. Was it the inflammatory rhetoric that made him pull the triggers on us? Was it an order to fire? We need to know that too. Were you truly just fearful for your life because Governor Rhodes said we were the worst type of people and we wanted to burn down, the streets of Kent? We just want to know the truth. And so I hold out hope that a National Guardsman will someday join us before they're all gone and they're disappearing. We're all older now. And I'm hoping that some of the soldiers that Trump is sending out to face protesters will take a stand with us and say, no, I'm here to defend the Constitution, not attack it.
Right. There are certainly differences between, and by the way, many in my chat, and I myself included, are having a real hard time you were believing that you were 18 or 19 at that particular time, because there's just no way. You look great. Everybody's still like looking you up in the chat. And I'm speaking to CHIC Canfora, who was at Kent State. Her brother was injured, and along with the other students who were injured and the 4 that were killed. I think you're absolutely right that one of them, I don't know I don't know how you would in that moment, because it has been such a flashpoint, that if you were one of the guardsmen that knew full well that the bullet that came from your gun killed or injured someone, that coming forward, the amount of strength that would take and self-reflection is an enormous lift. You might, I feel like you may get some, for lack of a better phrase, deathbed confessions, where people talk about this on their deathbed and have to clear their conscience because they're at the end of their life and cleaning this up. But it would be very difficult for, a person that was in that situation who, effectively, either actively because they wanted to do it or proud of doing it. So they may have told a bunch of people why they did it over the years, just not the press. They've said it at, at the kind of meetings that people who read the Turner Diaries go to, right? That would not surprise me with some of them. However, now we have, there's a couple of things too. A National Guardsman at that time would have a 5 or 10 shot rifle, a certain number of magazines with them, no body armor. I don't know if they wore helmets on that day. I believe some of them did, but not everybody, right? But it was a mix, but largely the guys in the front were wearing helmets or whatever. But there was no, and again, the training that they would be going to, the National Guard training at the time would be prepping them to go to Vietnam more than likely. That this is not normal National Guard training, right? These guys were the idea was that they're going to get swept up. These are the guys who were either rejected from Vietnam, which is bizarre, or were not ready yet. And they were like, these guys are a little slow, so we might need to take longer to train them to go to even Vietnam. Because of the extraordinary nature of that. There's a lot of humanity in this that is very hard to unpack. Now, you've got, if you look at the gear that people in these situations are wearing, they're basically wearing a personal tank compared to what a National Guardsman there. So the idea even that they would fire their rifle is even an order of magnitude more insane. Then you could excuse, they can survive a Molotov cocktail basically wearing what they're wearing and the gear that is around them, unlike the National Guard at the time, which is very easy to ratchet up. My point is that after Kent State, there was clearly there were congressional hearings about it. Were you present at any of those, or were you asked to be a witness at any of those things? Have you called for more of them? That kind of thing?
Well, I want you to understand that in 1970, when soldiers turned their guns on students,
yes,
the most militant among us didn't want to talk to even James Michener when he came. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to talk to the FBI. We didn't want to talk to James Michener when he came in and wrote a pretty fictional tale of what happened that day. Sure. Because we knew the repressive tactics of the Nixon administration. And now if they were willing to kill people, we wanted to lay low. Right. And not surprisingly, we held out hope that once the truth came out and all of the myths that the National Guard perpetrated in the immediate aftermath, that there was a sniper, that somebody actually planted a gun on the dead body of Jeff Miller, that they were surrounded or in fear for their lives because all rocks and bricks and bottles are being thrown at them. Fortunately, it's one of the most photographed and filmed events at that time. And those myths were dispelled pretty quickly. But just months later, the Ohio grand jury, instead of indicting the National Guardsmen for murder or manslaughter, indicted 24 students and 1 faculty member, including my brother and me and several of our friends. So while we didn't speak at the congressional hearings, we attended the trials, and we stood trial ourselves and welcomed the opportunity to face the National Guardsmen on the witness stand and under oath. But of course, our indictments were thrown out for lack of evidence. I was charged with second-degree riot. There was no proof we rioted. But when those trials ended, we had lost our chance to tell the truth of what happened. And that's why we've been out there every year doing it. But those myths are still perpetrated. The National Guardsmen didn't just have helmets. They had on gas masks.
Yeah.
So even the one momentary stone throwing incident of that day, which happened 20 minutes before they opened fire on us, was momentary. It was brief, and it was ineffective because students picked up stones in a gravel lot, threw them in the direction of the guard, and they fell short of the guard, who were 50 yards away. And guardsmen picked them up and threw them back at us, and it was more of a threat to us because we did not have the helmets.
Right.
We did not have the
you
gas
weren't-
masks to protect us.
Yeah.
And so that stone throwing incident stopped, and yet was used by the guardsmen, is still used by the guardsmen to justify death by firing squad. If you throw a rock at someone and you want to arrest them, student protesters who were more militant were willing to go to jail for destruction of property, for spray painting a building with an anti-war slogan. We're not willing to be shot death by firing squad 3 days after that act, and then to have the American people justify it. What about those windows that were broken? What about that building that burned 2 days before? That justifies the shooting into a random crowd 2 days later that you don't even know who's in that crowd.
Right.
That's, what goes on in the American psyche that lets you justify something that unconscionable.
Well, it's gone beyond that to the point where it is now a methodology. You look at Paul Manafort. I brought him up on our show before. Paul Manafort, hired by Donald Trump on Euromaidan, and when on Ukrainian, basically their push for independence, when they were ousting Yanukovych. Paul Manafort was working for Yanukovych and suggested to him, put snipers in towers, put provocateurs in the crowd. We will message the guys in the crowd when to act. They will throw stuff and then leave. Wait a few minutes and then open fire on the crowd. And they're, Paul Manafort directly responsible for the people that were killed on Euromaidan in Kyiv, and later went to work for Donald Trump for free to make himself whole with Russia or what have you. And Yanukovych now lives in Russia under his term. But they took what was effectively the accidental circumstance, and it was almost like a testing ground. Kent became a testing ground for how far you could push this. And again, luckily in the United States, we have not had a similar incident so far, and a lot of us are, holding our breath, hoping that nothing like that happens at these ICE protests. But there is an industry in this world that is almost based on how to excuse this kind of action in your own country that Paul Manafort effectively wrote the handbook for. His own daughters won't speak to him anymore because they believe he's evil, not only for that, but for what he did to their mother. But on top of that, not only did Trump hire him, and have him work for him in the beginning, he brought him back for this round. Yeah. He was at the RNC, and this is a guy who's taken his lesson from Kent State is, we can play this. We can send people to throw rocks, and they'll retreat, and then we can get rid of some of these people. That's, I think, where people are really holding their breath and going, we hope this violence doesn't ratchet up. Now, in your experience in preparing for the protests, what was the gatherings like? What were the meetings were like? What are we going to do? What are we going to say? As far as how they reached out to you or how you became involved in that, because I think there's this, we all believe in peaceful protest, and it's really beautiful to see people chanting peaceful protest right now. They're making a point of it, which is great. But the violent rioters seem not to be even in line with the cause that they are allegedly there for, and that's what makes everybody sort of so suspicious. When you were getting involved, what was the motivating factor for you? Was there a light bulb moment? Was there somebody on campus that you talked to regularly that you were just kind of like, let's get together, we've got to do something? How did that go?
I didn't come to Kent State an anti-war protester. I came fresh out of college, wanting to be exactly what I was in high school, an extension of what I was in high school. I wanted to be a cheerleader. I tried out for flasherettes. I was chairman of the rowboat regatta and social chairman of my dorm. But I couldn't go anywhere on my campus where I didn't see anti-war protesters. And although I threw their leaflets away initially, it wasn't until the war touched me personally that I started reading what the war was about. And that's why I caution student activists today, and even my activist friends that are like, everybody needs to be more militant now. Like, we can't be pacifist, and we can't be, if peaceful protests aren't working. There's a metamorphosis of awareness that happens with anybody who becomes an activist, and we need to have a big tent. I did not come to the anti-war movement because I understood the military-industrial complex or U.S. imperialism. I came because my brother's best friend died in Vietnam 10 days before, or we attended his funeral 10 days before May 4th. You know, that was fresh in our minds. We had other friends that were killed there, other friends that came home so emotionally scarred that they wouldn't even talk with us about the horrors that they committed there. That's when I came to care. And when I saw that my own brothers were being drafted into that war, that's when my actions became more militant. That's when I went from being uninvolved to being only there to peacefully protest. And then I became radical enough that I threw a stone through the Army recruitment office window on Friday night, May 1st, before the shootings at Kent State. Why? For the same reason that we were spray painting buildings, U.S. out of Cambodia now. We were willing to go to jail for malicious destruction of property if it meant we could call attention to the destruction of human life in Southeast Asia, to a president who, when we were 500,000 strong on the mall and he could see us out his window, President Nixon said, I'm just going to ignore that sea of protesters and I'm going to go watch a football game. That is what makes student protesters more militant. But when we talk with student activists today, I tell them, I'm not proud that I broke a window. It didn't make a dent in the war. And I know Kurt Herner, who watches your show, always says to me, yeah, that did make a dent for me. But it didn't make a dent in the war. It inconvenienced the recruiters. They had to sweep up the glass and whatever. But when we made a dent in that war was on Monday, May 4th, because we weren't just students at Kent State. We were students at Rutgers and Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Antioch and Berkeley, all at noon saying, we're not going to class anymore. Right. We're not going to graduate next week. We're not going to enter your corporations and contribute to your economy until you bring our friends home. That's when we got shot. We didn't get shot when windows were broken. We didn't get shot when a building burned 2 days before. We got shot during a peaceful protest because that's when we had the power. That's the voice they wanted to silence, was our strength in numbers. And that's why we need a big tent. We need to recognize the difference between our more militant faction that's willing to go a step further and go to jail to make a louder dent in the cause, for the cause. But we also have to be on guard for provocateurs, because we had those too. And if you read the COINTELPRO documents, then you know what J. Edgar Hoover did and many following. And I'm sure in the Trump administration, they're out there. Those are the people that are not just opportunists, but deliberate provocateurs that, like we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, that are trying to discredit peaceful protests. They're trying to discredit the movement. And so we train our students, and we did this in Ravenna during an SB1 protest. We isolated and took photos of someone that we knew didn't belong. He wasn't one of us, and he was trying to start some violence, and we need to expose those people, but we also need to be on guard because they look like us, they act like us, and then they don't.
Well, it wouldn't work if they didn't, and the irony is that there's so much paranoia about January 6th that the maggot crowd would like to, argue that there were FBI agents in the crowd whispering in their ear and making them charge into the Capitol, stab a cop with a pointed flagpole, and carry a Confederate flag into the United States Capitol. Apparently, they're that easily hypnotized. If only MK Ultra had it so easy on somebody that maggots are so dough-headed that you can just go attack and they just go okay. It's amazing to me. But I push back all the time on political violence of any sort, because I ultimately all it ever seems to do is give excuse to a harsher attack. And if you are visibly peaceful and you are in great numbers and you are showing your face, that is the fearlessness that makes them concerned. And right now, when we have people causing damage and they're wearing masks or whatever, to me, that's not even, they didn't even start protesting. If you're covering your face, you're not protesting, to me. Anyways, I think you have to, that's what makes protesting an extraordinary thing, is you go, I stand for what I believe in. Here I am with all these other people. You can see who I am, and I am amongst, fellow travelers in this. And once you cover your face, There's an element of like, I don't know what cause you're there for, and if I can even trust that you're not there to cause trouble just to ruin this whole thing for everybody.
Well, let's not ignore the optics now. Who's really covering their faces? The camouflaged ICE agents are hooded. They're masked. That's frightening. They strike in the dark of night, and they're grabbing immigrants who are in line for work, for their immigration hearings, or they're picking up their kids at school. They're storming into communities dressed not like badged and visibly uniformed law enforcement agents serving a free people. They're an occupying force. They're sent to intimidate citizens and make them disappear. It's inhumane, it's deliberate, and it's a tactic that's designed to terrorize. And I think that that's what's bringing more and more people to the cause. This is not the America we were taught to believe in. And it's a tactic we've seen before in the darkest chapters of our history that we vowed, never to repeat. And so I do want to qualify that I do not advocate for violence of any kind. I do want people to understand what makes some politically minded people become more militant, and I do believe that our government counts on that. The Trump administration. If you hear Donald Trump's comments when he was asked about the protest, when he was at his goofy military parade yesterday, when he was asked about the protests. It was just the most nonsensical answer that was so clear. He number one didn't know how many people were out there protesting. Far bigger. He finally got the crowd he loves, but it was
everywhere
antithetical
else
to what he.
Right.
Yeah. But he clearly didn't understand. There was no understanding of what was happening. What the people were protesting. Oh, I'm going to have to tell my daughter to get the dog out of here.
Don't worry about it. It's totally good. So one of the things that we've talked about too is that a lot of this ends up, why I called it sort of like wagging the dog inside the United States, is that what they are also confronted with is that what they have sold to get elected or to, get their own bona fides with this crowd is something that is effectively impossible. Not only are there not 25 million undocumented people, there's never been more than 11.5 in the country at any given time. And the new numbers that have just come out, and they're going to be released, I guess, later this week, is closer to 8.9. They went down since COVID because of COVID, right? Because people would rather stay home and work for less money than travel to another country, get sick and die. And so, and we had such high numbers because we counted them and we paid attention to it, that a lot of workers either stayed home, didn't come, or went home. And people are mortal. They live and die. They move. They change their lives. They travel to other countries. There's a lot more to this. And he's got to make everybody believe that there's this magical 25 million people and it's an invasion. But that seems to be dying its own death as well. And I think peaceful protest around this also takes away that distraction from him. He can't, if you have people burning stuff down, if you have people, throwing rocks at people or Molotov cocktails, there was a guy who was arrested throwing Molotov cocktails at police officers day before yesterday or 3 days ago now. If you have that, and that's eating up the news cycle, the fact that they're rounding up people in Omaha, Nebraska at a meatpacking plant, and the guy who owns the place says they all passed E-Verify, most of them are being scooped up, not because they're here illegally, but because Trump voided their protection status, and then now they're illegal. One day they aren't, next day they are, just by an act of fiat, an executive order. And so he's making his own myth come true. So what's the answer for people who want to get active to both pair themselves away from those that might undermine it, but also really feel like they want to make a difference for you? What has been the moments where you're like, this is something that did make a difference over the years, or in that instance, or in your own heart?
Well, certainly there is strength in numbers. When I look at what happened, like in Springfield, Ohio, when Trump was actually during his campaign suggesting that the immigrants there were eating the pets, the dogs and the cats of their neighbors and things like that. Like that really ticked off people who knew those
Sure.
people. That ticked off the even conservative legislators, local and state legislators, who recognized the power or the value of that immigrant population that actually built the city of Springfield to what it is. They
Yeah.
were the workforce of Springfield, and they're under attack now. And you can see Trump rolling back every other day. He's contradicting, his cabinet, who are out there trying to reach their quotas, and he's pulling back. Oh, now we didn't really mean to go after the restaurant workers. Oh, we didn't really mean to go after the hospitality workers. We didn't really, and it's going to be, and if the meatpacking industry puts enough pressure on him, he'll roll that back too. And what's sick about this corrupt government and this irresponsible cabinet is that they're not just making and enforcing these inhumane policies, but that they have to try to reach that number that's unreachable.
Right.
So they're sending a little girl who's here getting medical treatment because that's one more. They're ripping people away from their families and out of lines to pick their kids up at school, and pushing propaganda to make it look like they're finding and deporting millions of what they love to call them illegals, only to find that they're legally here.
Right.
But these illegals that they're talking about simply don't exist.
Right.
And all they're doing is inciting violence with their hateful words and actions. And it's really starting to piss people off. And people are coming out because they're seeing the contradictions there. That's what turned public opinion against the war in Vietnam. I don't know if you've seen the new Netflix series, but it really chronicles the lies dating all the way back to Kennedy, that not only got us into that war, but kept us in that war, even after the architects of the Vietnam War knew that all 58,000 men in my generation were dying for absolutely nothing, as the song War says. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. They died for nothing. And this is how authoritarian regimes function, where the people are divided against each other, and we have to worry about those other people that are taking our jobs or poisoning the blood of America, or raping our and pillaging our the people of our neighborhoods. They're treated like we were 55 years ago. A threat to be, as Governor Rhodes said, eradicated. Not as rights to be protected. Their right to be here and to seek citizenship, our right to protest the way they're being treated. People need to get back to our basic values in America, because they are not apparent, but they were yesterday. In what was it, 51? How many? Well, all 50 states. I mean, there were protests everywhere, and it was just
and
inspiring. It was inspiring to get all these pictures coming on my Facebook page and my phone, and it was like, wow, there were 1,000 people marching in Kent, Ohio yesterday. It was exhilarating. So, people are listening, and people are tired of the lies.
Yes, and there one of the most inspiring things I think of all was that we're not just seeing like one big rally in the big city in a state. Sometimes there are two or three because of the size of the environment. There are people that are going to one big one down at the state building, or if there's one in their city, but there's other ones that are doing it around the business center or around one of the schools or just down one of the thoroughfares. And we had multiple ones happening all at once. And the beauty of it was, I mean, we had a situation. Salt Lake City, there was a gunman showed up and fired into that crowd. A few people were critically injured. Insofar as I know, and we will check in a moment, I don't believe anyone has passed away from that. And we also have what happened in Minnesota, on Friday. They finally caught the guy. They have him in custody now, which, again, it brought to a close, like Saturday night it was, but it brought to a close this kind of like, ratcheting down of the entire area. Minnesota, like Minneapolis and St. Paul, would have had enormous marches as well. Not just their history with Black Lives Matter, but in general as the state that they are, had it not been for that one as well. So, there were people, I think, who didn't go, even as big as the crowds were, because they were afraid of this kind of violence. Not only someone like that who was out on the loose, but also the shooter at Salt Lake City. And that, again, that ratcheting up of the violence. I have a big problem and I know I'm a hardliner about this, and people get bugged with me about it, but using the word fight in political conversations. We need fighters. We need somebody who will fight for us. You need somebody who's going to fight for you to fight. Okay. I've never seen a boxing match in my life where they've said touch gloves and come out legislating, where, where both boxers went to the corner, sat at a table and started crafting legislation to increase the rights of women, in prenatal care for, poor women across the country, that kind of thing. That's not a fight. That's work. You have to we need like workers and people who will stand up. And I think that's more the phrase for what was going on at the time around Kent State, and around that time, there was a lot of like, we have to stand up for what we believe in. You're going to make a stand. And that stand was literally being there as a human wall, being there as to show who you were and say, I'm against what is happening. I'm not against you, because you're standing right there. I'm against the Vietnam War. I'm against the rounding up of undocumented people, and treating them like murderers and rapists and people seeking asylum, even though Trump apparently thinks that people who are seeking asylum come from asylums because he's a dough-headed moron. That really is his fixation. That's where he comes from. We know now also that he thinks that transhumanism means transgender for everyone and doesn't understand. Like, these words, maybe we're lucky. Because Nixon, for all of his drinking and flailing at the end, was a smart guy. Scary, as he was not stupid. He had bad ideas, but they weren't, intellectually dysfunctional. They were morally dysfunctional. Trump is both. And maybe we have that going for us, is that it's so ham-handed and it's so obvious and it's so ugly that it's hard to stand with him on it. Maybe, we can count that as a blessing. I do want to show some real quick before I get your response on this, is that because we spoke about this before, but there is a May 4th at kent.edu. There is there are a lot of things that there's memorial. You can go there. You can take a tour of the area. You can see the sites around it, what happened. And they have an augmented reality experience if you go there and bring your phone and whatever. But you can also do it from home and kind of like set a place where you are. And you can see where people were standing and what went on during that time, and understand how when violence gets ratcheted up and can be seen to, on both sides, can be seen to eclipse both sides' ideals. The ideals that the National Guard would stand for, which is the Constitution of the United States, which guarantees people's protection and their freedom to protest and the like, and that gets overrun. And the radical group that believes in peace, that turns into fighters, that burn buildings and throw things and create violence. There is a tipping point in the human brain where they cast off wholesale the values that they seem to espouse in that moment. And the goal should always be, I believe, to not pass that tipping point. So the question is, how do we do that? We've talked about how the National Guard. It would be great to hear what it was in the mind of those National Guard guys that fired. What led them to that moment? What led you to break that window? I'm curious. What led you to actually throw that stone through the window? And Grant, that's low res. I wouldn't call that quite an act of violence per se. Vandalism certainly. I've seen people do more for less. But what was it? What was that moment where you went from I'm talking about this, I'm standing for this, to that active thing? Like where were you in that moment?
Well, I was a political activist, and so my actions were politically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm ashamed of that action because I saw what it did to inspire opportunists to then, when I saw people breaking the windows of the Liquid Crystals Institute where they were manufacturing napalm, which was, a chemical used to just literally burn the skin and muscle down to the bone off of Southeast Asian people, or hitting AT&T, one of the war profiteers. But then when we saw people breaking the windows of the shoe store downtown or the drugstore, like that was heartbreaking for us. In fact, we went downtown the next day and took up collections and helped those shopkeepers board up their windows and pay pay for the damage, because we realized that not all of us are political in that situation. And while we want to hurt those who are profiting from the war and perpetrating the war, again, I don't think my militant actions made a dent, but I understand what made me do that. And it was truly not only attending the funeral of my brother's best friend 10 days before. He wasn't killed in combat. He was run over by a fellow soldier who was driving a tank that didn't operate correctly. And he was killed by one of his own fellow soldiers. But seeing his mother, and all that was left of Bill when she was handed the flag that was draping his coffin, and then just a week later, hearing that Nixon is escalating the war after he promised to wind it down, and knowing that more were going to die, and knowing that my brother's numbers were pulled in the draft and they would have to go fight too, that's when I looked at the Army recruitment office window and wanted to say something much louder than walk by and wave a peace sign, knowing that it was closed down at night and nobody would even know how angry I was at the escalation of the war. So that's what made me take a more militant stand. And so I understand why I did it. But the most important thing is I knew I was willing to go to jail for that. And that's what civil disobedience is all about in America. People that are willing, as Thoreau was, to go to jail, to not pay their taxes, or to sit down in the streets, or to march, across a bridge. We know the risks that we take when there are repressive tactics being used to silence our voices, and we're willing to take that risk. Some people aren't willing to take that risk right now. I see it all the time. Oh, I'm worried about, what my future and what it's going to look like. Well, if you're really worried about your future, how about just standing with us and protecting our democracy? Because that's the most important thing you should be worrying about right now.
Right.
And civil disobedience has been proven time and again in every movement to be successful. And I want to know where the clergy are, the real Christians, because, the ministers, we had nuns and priests walking out in the front of the lines and praying out loud as State Highway Patrol approached us and things. So I'm wondering where the faith-based community is here, because you can play in a very, and the Woodstock generation, we need to be out there in front, and we need to be protecting our young people, because we're fighting for their future. I'm fighting for the future of my children and my grandchildren. And so, we need to be thoughtful about what civil disobedience looks like. And the one thing that this generation has that our generation didn't have during the anti-war movement is, these are the children and grandchildren of the Woodstock generation. We'll be out there marching with you. We'll be out there with you.
Right. You guys didn't have that kind of backup in the older generations, because they hadn't quite come around to what this was quite yet. Although a lot of them did, even like, the greatest generation, a lot of the World War II vets who came back home were, many of them were against the Korean War, were against the Vietnam War, just were recognizing that while it was a mess, and while they may have, over time, they grew faster almost than anybody else because they knew the damage that could be done. And I do feel like one of the reasons, we don't see as much of a religious backup for it. We certainly see it in the Black Baptist Church in the South. You see certainly in Catholic churches all over the place because of their, the sort of the broad base of Catholics in the world, and a lot of, South American Catholics and the like. But it can be seen as sort of, self-interested churches, worried about their constituency, worried about their who's going to put dues in the plate, when it's passed around, as opposed to, the evangelicals, which are sided with, the whatever her name, like Trump's evangelical group that follows him around and preys on him all the time. All of them are conspicuously silent and against this. I will say that, one of the things that comes up about people's memories about this and thoughts about this is that oftentimes the evil seems one-sided and the goodness seems one-sided. And in doing that, it creates this false narrative that we're on either side of it. We're the good guys. We don't have to police ourselves. We don't have to behave ourselves because we're on the side of righteousness, lying for Christ and burning them down. And the Catholic bishop who said, of a town that was hiding 4 Templars, on Friday the 13th, many centuries ago, kill them all, God will know his own. which is where the Marines get kill them all, let God sort them out. That's directly from Friday the 13th utterance by a Catholic bishop, hunting down, killing an entire town of people because they thought these 4 people are good people and we're not going to turn them over to you to be killed. There are people who stand up in the wake of that all the time. And I feel like one of the things that can maybe inspire people is honoring those people that did not take up arms against their fellow citizens, that did not act in those moments, that were conscientious objectors, or like Hugh Thompson or Glenn Andreatta. These were guys at the My Lai massacre who landed their helicopter between citizens and the approaching
Yes.
Charlie Company and said, if you come closer to these citizens, we will kill you. Fire, and charging themselves to fire on their own fellow soldiers from America because they saw citizens being killed. Glenn Andreatta jumping out in live fire situation to bring a 4-year-old girl bloodied and wounded onto his helicopter where they could fly her to safety, while his own gunman was laying ground fire to stop approaching U.S. soldiers from approaching this line of people. There are those people, just like there are the agents provocateur, which we have talked about, in crowds that will undermine that thing, that will overact. There will be that Kent State, National Guardsman who can't wait to get his gun off, and maybe leads to everybody thinking, oh, we must be firing for some reason, and they join in, right? That, as much as there are those guys, and the guys who throw rocks and burn stuff and don't really care about the cause, who are just undermining everything. But there are also people on both sides of that go, you know what? If this ends, my life or my career or my livelihood, I will stop my side from going further. I will do this because what we're talking about matters, and seeing the humanity in another human being across the, if you're seeking peace, you have to kind of be it, in that situation. There is, I've always been inspired by the story of Hugh Thompson Jr. and those guys in the My Lai massacre, because it brings a tear to my eye that these guys, imagine what's going through your head when you are making a choice to land your helicopter between advancing troops that are firing live fire in your direction towards civilians. And you're like, I will put my body between them and those others. And there's a beauty in that I feel like we should all claim. And like you're talking about the religious leaders who would stand in front. And so when people go, religion is destroys everything. Religion is to blame for everything. I want people to remember that in the abolitionist movement and in the anti-war movement, and you'd see people like MLK and others standing at the front of these, Mahatma Gandhi and others standing as religious leaders in the front of these things, going, if my life is taken in this moment, it has value then. It shows its greatest value in that situation. So I know I only have you for a couple of more minutes, and I do want to encourage people to go to the Kent State Memorial and really take it in. Is there something you think that's germane directly to what we're going through right now, that people could pay attention to in terms of Kent State and what happened around it? Details that you experienced or that they can look into.
Well, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we had an assassination attempt this week. I mean, we were also worried about whether or not the violence of the soldiers who were actually being the ones that were attacking people and pushing people back, that was going to result in someone's death, only to find that there was 2 assassination attempts and 1 successful in Minnesota. And one of the scary parallels here is that the rush to judgment and the rush to immediately brand it as something that came from the left. Senator Mike Lee publicly labeled immediately the shooter a Marxist. He had no evidence of that. It was, even though it was widely mocked and criticized as misinformation, it's out there. And I'm still seeing it out there. You had Elon Musk right away push this narrative that the shooter was far left. He tied the incident to left-wing violence. It doesn't matter how many fact checkers jump on this. it's in the ethos, and it's being pushed out. And of course, you got Laura Loomer, who falsely claimed the shooter was a Tim Waltz employee. She was the one behind that one, trying to link him to the No Kings movement just because he happened to have not only a hit list in his car, but a flyer for the No Kings movement,
Right.
which, immediately
Which is
should
like
have
saying
meant,
he's a police officer because he was wearing the costume. Right.
right. Like, so we really need to understand, that right-wing media and the conservative figures that promote these false narratives are putting people in danger. And you've got Trump, who you don't see the flags lowered at half-mast. He supposedly like condemned it, like, oh, this, we don't want to be doing this,
Yeah.
but acknowledging it. And he has a perfect opportunity, if he truly was the president of the United States, by what we come to believe should be the president of the United States. He should not only memorialize that, what happened there, but he should take that opportunity to not just denounce, but dissuade people, especially his supporters, that, especially those crazies that he pardoned and freed from prison and made them think they were heroes for wanting to hang Mike Pence. They were heroes for wanting to kill congresspersons. So when you pardon them and label them as hostages, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to see people assassinating legislators and senators, on the Nancy Pelosi's, those that they demonize. We already saw somebody take a hammer to the husband of Nancy Pelosi. Like, when are people going to realize the role of this inflammatory rhetoric, the danger of, not having the free press that we had, the Walter Cronkites, who actually, when he realized the lies that being perpetrated about the Vietnam War, he took off his mic or whatever he was wearing back then, and put on a flak jacket and a helmet and went to Vietnam and came back and said, this war is unwinnable and we need to just call it a day and stop letting people die for nothing. Like, we need a free press. And we need some kind of control on misinformation, or else these kinds of things that are out there, the misinformation about even an assassination, is just going to lead to more if people get it wrong.
Agreed. I also think that there was a period where Trump owning the fake news narrative and trying to put down anything he didn't like was fake news, but anything that got through that he liked was somehow good. And I see this all the time on my show when I'm doing clips from right-wing media sites or whatever. They will decry the legacy media, but they cite it constantly if they want backup for a detail that they are talking about. They will go to the New York Times. They will go to Axios. They will go to ABC, NBC, or CBS, and with zero irony. What I would see from Trump and his crowd is that I think they have largely overplayed their hand, and it is so ham-handed the way that they are doing it. And I think maybe they operate under the illusion that it should be easier to convince people, that propaganda should be, all you do is repeat it over and over. It was easy before. They still think he's a businessman. They still think he's, that he never met these women, right? They still believe that part of it, I guess. But now he's in a situation where he can't outrun gravity, where we are, a little bit of this is you can look at the crowds that gathered all across this country that stood up to him, all, peaceful, and the violence that did occur came directly from right-wingers who are trying to strike back against this. And that again, visibly peaceful has to be the way, because that contrast is what will draw people, to know that we're on the right side of history and the right side of this issue, and not jumping to conclusions when not taking the bait, I think in many ways, because that left-wing storyline did carry for a while. They caught the guy alive, so, which is, going to eat their narrative, quite frankly. But he is, Vance Luther Butler, the reason they thought he was, I guess, Waltz had reappointed him to a board he was on. And then he left and went to the DNC, and he went DRC. He went to the Democratic Republic of Congo to be a evangelical anti-gay preacher, because I guess there's money in that. And then he came back and started a security company, and then just became a nutcase. That can't be like, that's where the language fight, I avoid it as much as I can. I want to see people stand up. We need people who will stand up. We need people who will show their face and be proud of the side that they are on and the beliefs that they have. And people like you, CHIC Canfora, who joined us this morning, I can't tell you, it's very exciting. And you're welcome back anytime. I hope it's under other circumstances. Here's what I will say though. I know this is the cause celeb of your life, and because of your experience, this is a driving force in what you talk about and what your activism is based on. But I would like, real quick, if you wouldn't mind, the issues that stand out for you in terms of governmental politics, electoral politics, whatever, policies, programs, things that you believe in. What would be the thing that is these days your kind of driving, impetus in these things? Whether anything from school lunches to breast cancer, but you know what I mean.
Well, besides student activism, because we know the role that students have historically been the conscience of America, and so many
Yes.
movements can be credited to the student anti-war movement, and my own activism can be. But we also know from other movements, including the Black Lives Matter movement, that it can just be one person, two people. So it can start with a social media post. It can start
Yes.
with the quilt that drew attention to AIDS that was ignored. But in Ohio right now, it's Senate Bill 1. Where we just closed our women's center, our LGBTQ plus center, our multicultural center at Kent State, of all places, because, diversity, equity, and inclusion are under attack, which means we don't want an even playing ground for people in Ohio. We want it to be, it's white supremacy rules when you come into those kinds of bills. And so we have a very strong repeal effort, and we'll get that on the ballot. And just like SB 5 that put collective bargaining on the ballot, they tried to take that away from us, and Ohioans pushed back. People think of Ohio as a red state, but Ohio pushed Obama over the limit with just really hard work, with boots on the ground, hard work. And we can do that again. And I think I'm so proud of those people who were out there yesterday. Some of them were posting, "This is my first protest ever." I remember that exhilarating feeling. It's growing. And what they need to know, and I think you played a part in making that happen today, is they're not alone. You're not alone. All of you who were out there yesterday, you're standing on the shoulders of many, many people before you who sought to make a difference and weren't afraid to be heard and to be seen. And we have to just keep doing that. As we talked about before, there is strength in numbers.
Right.
And we can do this again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, CHIC Canfora, for being with us this morning.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
It wasn't just our cause 55 years ago wasn't just the war. It was the right to vote, which is something that is sorely missing right now. And so that is my other cause, is registering young people to vote. You're not voting. You have to vote. Look at the consequences of not voting in the last election. We fought for the right to vote because we were 18 years old in my generation. We could be drafted to fight in a war waged by people for which we had no choice in their election. But now you have the right to vote. We fought for that. Please use it. Please register.
Absolutely.
And know who you're voting for and who you need to vote out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, CHIC Canfora.
Okay.
And again, that's the politics of it. This is not a social movement in that regard. I love that people want to get together socially and all that, and people need to build bridges and reach across. But ultimately, we have to get people elected that will carry out the things that we want, and it matters. And it's a long-term thing that we all need to be involved in. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a great pleasure. Great talking to you. And I still can't believe that you were actually at Kent State, because you look younger than me. Okay. Much love. Thank you.
It's kent.edu/May4.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. There she goes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Appreciate that. I'm going to bring on in just one moment. I have ASF ROMIROWSKY joining me as well to talk about what the situation in Iran and in Israel. This is my first time talking to him as well, and there's so many questions and things that I would need to talk about. So, Asif, can you hear me real quick, and I will bring you in? You sound all right?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay, let me bring you in right here. There you are, sir. Welcome. Good to talk to you today. So, obviously, we are in a situation. First of all, if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself and tell anybody your kind of bona fides that would trigger them. You're the executive director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. But what drew you to that job, and your kind of a short bit of your background and why the path that led you here.
Sure. So by training, I'm a Middle East historian, and I deal with our group deals with mobilizing faculty to deal with anti-Semitism and BDS on American college campuses. Not to mention restoring balance when it comes to the academy as it relates to dealing with the analysis of the Middle East. And so for me, it's out of my own wheelhouse, and the nonprofit that I had, to my mind, ensures that our institutions are balanced and we have a place of where to send our kids and grandkids to.
Well, so there's a ton to unpack. Obviously, since Thursday, Friday, that was Trump set this 60-day line. When at the 61st day, Israel launched their attack against Iran. Clearly with the go-ahead from the Trump administration, no matter what they would say about this. I would argue that, whether you would call it preemptive or prescriptive, it is clearly an aspect of the fact that Iran has been building a nuclear weapon, or at least intends to, thinks that it's really their only path to, like owning their space. I think they look with envy upon Pakistan or other countries that have them, that you get left alone if you have one. But they also, the spoken word of the Ayatollah and everybody there is death to Israel, death to America, on the regular. So it's really hard to just kind of wash this away in like North Korea getting 2 more nukes when they really don't seem to care about the rest of the world. It's only if they would be attacked. Whereas Iran seems proactive in their language about it. If you don't mind, a bit of a history lesson in that, and your take on what I just said.
Sure. So let's contextualize it, first of all, from a kind of a larger historical perspective. Iran has been a threat since, the revolution in Iran back in 1979. If you look back at the historical narrative as far as all the threats that have been waged on the United States and the war against terror stem from the revolution in 1979, much of this ideology, as you stated correctly, is indeed anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Israel. The way they view this entire worldview is that America is the large Satan, Israel is the small Satan. This satanic connection cannot be dealt with. And so because the West is so promiscuous, it's so awful, everything they stand for, we need to do whatever it takes by all means to eradicate them by all means possible. It's also important from a theological standpoint to understand the fact that Iran, this is also at the heart of the tension between Sunnis and Shiites, and the ultimate goal of Iran as a Shia larger dominant force has to do with the fact that they believe that the solidifying of Iran as the true successor of the Prophet Muhammad himself and Shiism at large has to happen through what is considered to be some kind of apocalyptic event, that they also use nuclear force to bring back their Messiah, the Mahdi, that will come back and solidify that. So there's a theological element to all this at large. In recent times, over the past 18 months and now over 600 days, the entire multi-front war that Israel has been fighting, and when it comes to Gaza, has been the multi-front war with Iran. Iran is the head of the Hydra. All of Iran's proxies, namely Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they've been the patrons of all of this. And it got to a tipping point, and to the Israelis, as much as there was a major intelligence screw-up, to say the least, on 10/7, they have been laser focused on Iran for the past 30 plus years, and they had their number. This was a magnificent intelligence and a military operation where the Israelis had Mossad and Intel operatives on the ground. They were able to surgically remove the head of the GC leaders, scientists, and were able to target specific areas. It got to a point where we're talking about weapons grade uranium that Iran was could have the potential of 9 to 12 atomic bombs as far as where they were going with that. Israel could not live with that and would not live with that. And as you said properly, Trump gave them 60 days, and on day 61, Israel decided to move forward. And there's no doubt, to your point as well, that while the United States does not have boots on the ground with this, they did get the blessing of the United States. Trump, the administration, was aware of that. And in Netanyahu's press conference, he indeed acknowledged the fact that he thanked the administration for supporting Israel here.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, it's a question whether Trump is that involved in any of this stuff, and what his awareness is like, on a personal level, because he seems to think in very much binary ideas, and he wants to be the key player in this situation. Whereas, I honestly, in 1 second, I'm going to try and do you think you could increase your volume on your side? I'm maxed out on my side, but if you could just bring yours up a little bit on your microphone, it might help out a touch. Okay, let's see, checking one. Yeah. Let me see. Can you? Is
that better? Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Yeah, that's a little better. Thank you. I think Netanyahu is dealing with, as much as I don't like the man, I think he's dealing with a reality that some can say he drew into his transom, or it was laid at his doorstep, or it was just a historical aspect of this is where things were headed for a very long time. And Donald Trump, in terms of his, habitual wick lighting, lit the wick of the situation that we're directly in right now, the timing of it, by getting out of the Iran deal when he first came in with no follow-up. He did not have a plan to replace it or a situation other than old-fashioned sanctions, which is what got us to where we were previous to the need for a deal. He seems to do the same thing. He eliminated the COPS program, and we had Chauvin 2 years later. He eliminated the pandemic response team, and 2 years later, we had COVID in the United States, and there was no ready response to this. So I don't know how much he's involved in it. Hegseth, and I think the Joint Chiefs, more than likely, I don't know that Hegseth is brought in on this, but the Joint Chiefs are clearly, they have had an Iran plan for a long time, whether it involved Israel or not. And we know this because Donald Trump showed it to someone, and it was part of, the case against him in the classified documents thing, that he was showing the plan that we would have if indeed Iran attacked Israel directly. But Iran was never going to attack Israel directly until this all ratcheted up. It was through Hezbollah, through the Houthis, and through Hamas that they did this. I have made the case for a long time, and this from a historical standpoint, I would love your take on this. I've made the case that for those of us that believed in a two-state solution, or the possibility of a two-state solution, or the desirable aspect of a two-state solution, that what that meant changed after 2005. That once Hamas took over in Gaza, a two-state solution no longer meant two equal countries that pick their own leaders, where people can live freely in both countries, and that's happening. If there happen to be Jews in the Palestinian territories, they will be fine, and if there happen to be Palestinians in Israel, they can live as they want. When in reality, after 2005, it seems like Hamas was like, their idea of a two-state solution was zero Jews. No Jews in Hamas-owned territories, and very, likely if they grew and developed strength, in the West Bank as well. And that tension was a wick that had been lit by their own doing alongside all this other stuff. Is there, do you think that's a good assessment of what happened after 2005 and when Hamas took over? Was there a sea change in the ideology of what meant to be a Palestinian in Gaza versus before that?
Well, it predates Hamas's involvement. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the ideology as far as Yasser Arafat and company, which is why he was able to avoid and circumvent any kind of signing of any agreement, including from Oslo beyond, was the fact that they believed that the whole area should be Judenrein, that is, Jewish free. And so, Hamas amplified all of this. What happened in 2005 was that Israel disengaged from Gaza. Israel gave the entire area to the Palestinians. Hamas was elected and took over, democratically elected, as much as you call it democracy, by its own people in 2006. And for 20 some years, they've been building this entire terror infrastructure. The only difference between Hamas and the PLO is that Hamas is more religiously, ideologically zealot, whereas the PLO is maybe more Marxist and more secular. But they have the same objectives, and that is the destruction of the state of Israel. I mean, the idea of the fallacy of the two-state solution, as we are here now, concretized by all of this, is that there's a lack of recognition, and they refuse to, no matter what happened. And in Oslo, all the years that we spoke about changing textbooks and giving back land, and trying to move along, every time it came to the actual point of signing the document, moving forward, Arafat shut it down. That was until Arafat died in 2004. Once that changed, Abbas was appointed. Hamas takes over, and Hamas's entire charter is based on the destruction of the state of Israel. So that's part of their narrative, and this is what led us from 05, 06 to 2023, as far as and the cacophony and the barbarism, and and the way that they orchestrated 2023 and the Gaza war. That's one aspect that played out here as that goes. And by the way, if you poll Israeli society today, even Israelis on the left really don't believe there's anybody to talk to on the other side, given the ongoing war in Gaza. And it's not to say they didn't want to. Look, we have the validation. The majority of the people who were taken hostage were peace workers, people who were working and trying to, come together. And so there is a reality check as far as, is peace possible and what are the conditions to make this happen? If you zoom out further out, I mean, the argument when it comes to Iran, it was not about having, a deal. It was a question of whether or not the deal was good. And a bad deal was not going to work out. The previous administrations have been engaged in what I would consider to be a kind of a realignment of the Middle East and a shift, especially under the Obama administration. There was a sense by our own traditional allies, Sunni allies, namely Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, that America is moving away from that traditional alliance and is moving on to a Shia-Iranian alliance altogether. And we also believed, I think that, let's, if you want to call it naivete or whatever you want to look at it, that you could win Iran over by providing economic carrots to dissuade them from their ideology. Billions and millions of dollars, that didn't change one iota at large. And so the ideology continues. And I think that
well, do you think there's a separation? It's a great point, and I want to touch on that for a second. Do you think that's a part of the bifurcation between the Iranian people and the leadership since the revolution? Because there's clearly, Iran again was famously a place where the Brits went skiing before the revolution, and since then there's been an increasing divide, it seems at times very stark, between the leadership of Iran and the general populace of Iran. There's a bunch of people like Iranian streamers that I sort of check in with to see what they're doing, where their families are having little like parties, celebrating the destruction of IRGC members because they know those people rounded up their relatives, years ago and are currently, oppressing them in that regard. So the Iranians, as this sort of, there is not, it's hard to tell whether there's that separation between Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza. Now there seems to be some breakout protests and the like, that are happening in Gaza, but there is a much bigger bifurcation, it seems, that can be plied, if, and even Netanyahu made a statement, sort of to the Iranian people, we don't have a problem with you, we have a problem with your leadership. Mm-hmm. Is that going to land? Is there progress to be made there? Is that, because this is, everybody's regime change has, been a hashtag for a long time and a reason that people get bogged down in wars, especially in the Middle East. And yet that seems to be what they're talking about here, because it isn't the people necessarily, but the regime itself that, that oversees the entire country.
Oh, 100%. The bifurcation that you're talking about has been real for a very long time. Let's go back to the Green Revolution, go back to any time, women's rights in Iran. I mean, the regime is the target here, not the people of Iran. I mean, really the abuse of everything has been about Iran, about the Iranian people. They've been abused by their own, by the Ayatollahs, by the regime itself. And so talk about the censorship and regarding Iran itself and what's been going on for decades now. All you have to do is look at many of those who were able to leave Iran in the 1980s and come here and talk about their own stories as far as what they were able to, they think back about Iran pre the Shah, as far as 1979. That shifted everything. And by the way, many of these individuals, including the head of the IRGC, who was taken out now, the general Hussein Salami, was actually part of the taking of the hostages, back in 1979. So, I mean, we have a long history of illustration, if you needed validation, to how their animosity towards the West works. But I think that Iran, again, has been hijacked by a totalitarian ideology that has been running, and this is where it's all been coming from. So I think we do have to make that distinction as well, if we actually care about, changing the regime, changing the entire infrastructure of the country itself, and what that represents. That is clearly a case, and many of Iranian dissidents who are here in the United States talk about that. Interestingly enough, as the rockets were coming in, you heard people, on social media calling "Death to Khamenei." We're happy, where they were clapping and whatnot. So again, if that is any kind of anecdotal, looking for kind of validation, it's definitely there.
Yeah, there's, people who watch my show know this, but I'm a Mason, and the Grand Lodge of Iran, the Masonry Lodge that's been there was there for years since the revolution, has met in Los Angeles. They meet in exile because they are not allowed, because they are a democratic body. We are, at our root, we are a democratic body. We believe everybody's equal and everybody should have a shot at running the joint. And that in and of itself was enough for them to be driven from the country. There is a huge, Persian or Iranian diaspora in Los Angeles and other areas. And their reaction to it seems to be a lot brighter than most people would expect. It's obviously a very dangerous situation. There's a lot of lives at stake. There's nothing to, be flippant about in this. But they are, it seems like something they have been waiting a long time for. I have a couple of questions. And by the way, ASF ROMIROWSKY is Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. You have a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies, and you went to King's College London? Yeah. Yep. And Mediterranean Studies, yeah. So you can help us maybe unpack some of the things that my audience, there's a lot of Gordian knots in the Middle East when discussing the politics, especially when you find out who started what. But there was a big thing that happened this weekend beyond the Greta Thunberg boat. There were a bunch of people who staged a march to Gaza, and they landed in Cairo and were snatched up by the Egyptian authorities. And I don't think people understand Egypt's part in the blockade against Gaza. There are, I want to say 6 or 7 walls that they have on the border of Gaza and Egypt. And they rounded these folks up and deported them immediately. They were not messing around. And some of them were manhandled violently in the process. And this is not necessarily something this certainly didn't happen when Israel grabbed Greta Thunberg's boat. Everybody was given a sandwich and a bottle of water, and they were deported. But no one was, physically harmed, insofar as I know. I mean, obviously, I even from her, I've not heard that actually happened. But the ones that landed in Egypt and were going to walk, I guess, to the border and go into Gaza. The Egyptians had a very strong reaction to that idea. Maybe unpack a little bit of the Egyptian history, both with Hamas or Iran, and why they would have such a strong reaction to something like that.
So let's be clear. I mean, first of all, Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, was started in Egypt in 1928. I mean, so from their perspective, they're fighting terrorism. They understand what Hamas represents. You might remember that stint of, when Morsi was when the Brotherhood took office in Egypt, and then you had all the rioting inside of Egypt. Egypt will never go back to that. And they see Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood affiliate, which it is.
Gotcha.
And so when it comes to fighting terrorism, the perspective, and this is exactly why they rejected the Trump offer, because Trump basically said, that, reconstitution, the resurrection of Gaza should be, by removing the people outside. And let's be clear here, Gazans are ideologically, socially, politically Egyptian. And so, and West Bankers are ideologically, socially Jordanian.
Jordanian,
So
yeah.
What you're talking about here. And so the Egyptians said, no. We can only reconstitute inside of Gaza. It's Israel's problem. And for years, by the way, to tell you how the Egyptians feel about Gaza, from the Egyptian side, they've been the one who have been putting in the sewer water inside to Egypt. They have no love for the Gazans, and what goes on, and especially Hamas itself. And so,
sorry, how do you mean? Like the sewer water from Gaza goes into Egypt or something, and that's something the Egyptians have reacted to, or
the Egyptians throw their sewer water from the Egyptian side into Gaza.
Oh, wow!
To tell you symbolically how much they feel about, how they feel about, their brethren. But the smuggling that's been taking place all along here has been going on the Egyptian border. That's why the Philadelphia route has been part of the challenge as well. But from the Egyptian narrative, they rather it be Israel's problem to solve this problem because they have their own issues as far as fighting terrorism. They're not looking for terrorists as far as they're concerned to come into their own borders. And there has been concern on the Egyptian side, specifically in the Sinai area, as far as mounting terrorist activities and jihadi groups and whatnot. They're not looking for more fellow travelers to join them. So there's no doubt that immediately you had some kind of so-called March for Peace coming in. They were never going to open up the border to make that happen. They don't tolerate any of this kind of nonsense as far as they're concerned.
Right.
And so that's a red line.
Yeah, it certainly seemed like their reaction to peace activists coming in was even harsher than Israel. Well, Israel's wasn't seemingly harsh at all, but it was very harsh. They had a very strong reaction to it that I think was surprising to a lot of people, especially the people who were doing the March for Gaza. They seem to be completely caught off guard by this, which is curious to me, because you would think that if you're going to involve yourself in a situation like this, you would want to know as much about where you're going and what you're getting yourself into as you possibly could. Even the other side of it. Even if you disagree with the other side, you're going to want to know what they're going to feel about you when you show up. Agreed? Yeah. If somebody's going to be if you're going to go visit Iran, which I think I, amongst other people, would love to do one day if it ever returned back to, the country that it was before the revolution, you could come and go. Even if, tourist people, vloggers, they go to Iran sometimes and they film street food and that kind of stuff and show the culture that still exists there and all that stuff. But they're aware where they are, what the limitations are on what they're allowed to do. I had minders when I went to China. I was very aware of it all the time. And I went there for years. I did a show in China and I was back and forth there all the time. And I knew that the government had put somebody with me and that there were things that if I stepped across a line, I better be out of the country when I do it. If I'm going to tell the truth about this country, I got to leave before I say it, because if I say it there, I'm never getting out. And I feel like whether you disagree with it or not, maybe these folks to some degree support what the Egyptians, the hardline or something, or support what Hamas would do to them in many cases if they went in there and they just want to show solidarity even if they disagree. Because quite frankly, Hamas would throw a bunch of these folks off a rooftop. That is clear. Both the people that were with Greta Thunberg and certainly the people who were in this march. If you're okay with that, at least go in knowing the circumstance, knowing what you're facing. So in the Israel-Iran conflict, like, what are your thoughts about the next week or two? Is this Israel... it seems to me that they're not going to pull punches this time. This is not about isolated strikes or something. This for the better is another 6-day war to some degree, or some sort of action similar to that. Yes.
100%. I mean, look, and the difference between this and the Six-Day War, which was again a magnificent military victory, that was conventional, and here we are dealing with non-conventional threats. And so the reason Iran is the biggest destabilizing force in the region, because they were going to elevate from the conflict of the Middle East, maintaining at a conventional military level, to moving it to non-conventional. That's the biggest destabilizing factor vis-a-vis Iran. And the concern was always, from the Israeli perspective, what happens, if Iran, if Iran smuggles dirty bombs to Hezbollah, the Houthis, to Hamas, and other proxies that they have. And so they're right around the corner, whereas, Iran is, thousands of miles away as far as dealing with, the reality as far as how this plays out. But the fact of the matter is that this is a game changer moment. This will change the face of the Middle East. And there is no doubt about it. And while I think that the Arab world is giving a nod, they don't want to necessarily get involved coming with the Saudis and other Sunni countries, but they all understand the threats. They understand exactly what Iran has been representing. And if you talk about Saudi Arabia, going back to my earlier points, Iran represents a direct threat to Mecca, which is, of course, the navel of the entire Muslim world, which is guarded by the Sunnis, namely Saudi Arabia. And so they understand all of that. At least when it comes to Israeli-Saudi relations, there is not full normalization. That's the hope as far as where things might go if things go forward. But the fact of the matter is there has been military collaboration on the larger threats. And I think that Israel is doing what needs to happen now. It will take a long time. This could take weeks. This is not like a day-to-day event, but things are very fluid. But it got to a crescendo that needed to be dealt with yesterday. And this is where we are.
Yeah. So, and looking forward to again, I think some people are confused also. And because you have a great historical perspective on this, I think it's important to is there a difference between Sunni and Shia in their belief systems and where they come from, in how and if they can interact with the rest of the world? Is it easier for a Sunni country to engage with the greater non-Muslim world than a Shia country to engage with it because of the essence of the religious philosophy that is at heart of either one?
In simplistic terms, I mean, again, there are radical Sunnis and there are radical Shiites, as we saw during the war itself. Hamas, for example, is Sunni, and Hezbollah is Shia, and they've all been sponsored by Iran, all under a greater evil, that is the existence of the state of Israel in the United States. And so the jihadi movement are able to cross lines even with their theological understanding and interpretation. If you take it to like a more simplistic trying to understand the level of interpretation vis-a-vis the Quranic verses, Shiites are more orthodox in their interpretation. So that is to say, for example, when the Islamic Republic of Iran issued a fatwa on Salman Rushdie, a fatwa literally meant a death warrant on somebody's, on somebody's back, and it literally meant death. So it's binding. Whereas Sunni interpretation could be a little less lax in that perspective as a prescribed recommendation. The ultimate cleavage between Sunnis and Shiites relate to who is the true successor of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Because the Prophet had no sons, this is where the crux of a debate takes place here. And so all the years of the Islamic empire, there have been Sunni empires and Shia empires. And when you talk to Iran, they talk about the Persian Empire as far as the largest time, historically speaking, where Iran and Persia was the navel of the entire world. And so that's how they think about themselves in kind of these grandiose terms. That being said, I think that ultimately the United States, when we talk about U.S. Muslim relations, we've had much better successes with the Sunni world, who's been willing to work with us on some of these issues. And then what you're seeing now in the Gulf, and you're seeing now, as far as Saudi Arabia, Israel is willing to work, is working with a lot of these countries. So there's a little bit more openness to dealing on the secularism that plays out here.
Well, do you think that's written into the kind of code of the belief system? Because in Shia, it's bloodline. It's about like a cousin or a brother, or that carries on the line, and it's much more like a monarchical magic blood situation that you might have with any kind of monarchy, but much more intense because of the circumstance of the world around it. Whereas Sunni, the imams can be picked by consensus. It's almost like a vote, almost like a pope. And that's a little closer to, realizing you have to build bridges and engage with other people, because that kind of balance happens in the Sunni world if they're going to pick a leader, yes, versus Shia, which is just like, he was your dad, this is the kid, that's the, direction we're going to go. I mean, is that why they're easier to deal with? More than just being orthodox in that regard. Yeah.
It varies from country to country. I mean, it depends on the configuration. Political Islam has to do with the way these countries are being operated. There's a question also of, within Arab Muslim states, there was also a feature of Arab nationalism that also played into all of this. And so not all Arabs are Muslim, and not all Muslims are Arabs. I mean, so you have to look at the configuration of the state itself, which is being governed. And so this is also part of it. I mean, look, a country like Turkey and Turkey today, when it relates to they are not Arabs, they're Turks. However, when they define themselves as far as an identity perspective, however, they align themselves, Erdogan, with Iran, with Khamenei. I mean, so you have to look at, the different patterns and the footprints of each one of these countries and where you can look about change. When you talk about a country like Saudi today, MBS is a very different kind of leader, and as far as looking to the West, and there's also geopolitics to play into all of this. And so you have to look at a variety of components to play out here as far as the dominance. That being said, all Muslims believe in the 5 basic pillars of Islam. Shiism adds a little bit more to their orthodoxy and whatnot, and how they interpret Islam as well. And to that point, which is the critical point of what we're dealing with now, the difference between the impact of Islamism, the radical Islam aspect that drives these jihadi groups within the Muslim world. And as you can see, there is a crossover between Shiites and between Sunnis, who are all willing to come together under a greater evil, that is their animosity towards the United States and towards Israel.
Sure. And how much do you think this has to do with, and by the way, I'm talking to ASF ROMIROWSKY, is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. How much do you think this has to do with what is effectively the death of oil over time? We're seeing oil prices go up right now, or whatever, but as the world shifts away from a direction where it seemed we were inexorably headed, which was all developing nations will develop through oil and gas, and that was the sort of the resource curse of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. Saudi Arabia is famously, it hit peak oil a long time ago, maybe functionally out compared to other countries. Iran may have big stores, but that doesn't mean they can get it out of the ground, or that, by the time they do, it will matter in the world stage. China's economy, they were all counting on as rising the desire for oil over time. We're headed to an oil glut by the end of this year. That the shuffling of power and the weakness of the Iranian regime might be tied to the fact that, if the world shifts away from this kind of resource mentality, you got to get along. It's different when you're selling your culture and your cultural goods and your farm goods than I'm standing on the thing the world needs to run, and if you don't listen to me, you can't have it. Is that playing the part in the geopolitics now?
Well, it's a feature here. I mean, look, Iran has been trying to get its hand on the frozen assets, that are sitting in escrow, and the money that was frozen under, on different aspects as far as, they need it for their economy. Let's not forget who Iran's allies are. As far as the Belt and Road, they look at China and Russia, and as far as connections that are going on there, again, these are part of the adversary axis of the United States. But the geopolitics for sure are playing out here. I mean, look. Part of, if you look, for example, now at Trump's visit to the Middle East, this was about China, because the Chinese trying to buy out the Middle East. What he did, and I think in a way to try to bring back relationships and try to get investment in the United States, was to counter the Chinese investments in the Middle East, who they've been trying to buy up the area. So there is indeed a feature to all of this that's playing out here, and how the oil has been used and abused. Let's not forget the time, when after we had our economic problems here, Biden tried to go to the Middle East, to go to Saudi Arabia, and basically MBS's response was like, now you need me, you're going to come back to me and talk to me about oil when you tried to screw me over when it comes to the Iranians. And so, you have to look at, there has been an attempt to realign the Middle East and different powers that are going out here. For years we've been talking about between East and West. Now things are shifting between North and South as far as how, as far as Indochina, and impacting as far as, the economics of all of this. So the economics clearly play a feature here, but it's also a question of how they are literally, and no pun intended, weaponized by the people by the governments who are controlling them, and where the relationships are taking place here. When the Abraham Accords, for example, took place back in 2020, positively, when you saw what Israel and the Gulf states, they were mostly based on economic exchanges, and at the time also helping out with vaccinations when it came to COVID and other kind of things. And so the whole nature of what's the give and take as far as helping and seeing Israel by the Sunni states as an added value, not as a liability, but actually as an added value, also is shifting in that regard and how they look at that. And not to mention the fact, which is another dimension to all of this, is that you have non-state actors who are trying to be treated like state actors, like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis and whatnot, who are operating freely in these countries and taking over the ideologies. You're seeing it in Lebanon with Hezbollah in Lebanon. You're seeing it when it comes to the Houthis in Yemen. So all of that is another dimension as far as trying to, what our job is, or trying to parse out the Middle East and trying to remove the radicalism to deal with the state actors.
Right.
These are all part of the dimensions that are playing into this whole configuration, and the economics are indeed a feature here.
Sure. So we often talk about like the kind of size of the countries versus the attention that they get. Israel getting an outsized amount of attention in the world all the time compared to the size of the countries around them, and even you could argue within Saudi Arabia, Yemen, or in Iran itself, or Iran, Iraq. You have battles over the years that have resulted in far more casualties between these two countries, those pairs, than have even gone on in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. And yet the attention seems to be focused largely on there. I want to talk a little bit about Lebanon and Syria, the shift in Syria that's either happening or has frozen in space. It's hard to know like what the power structure is there, but there is clearly a trend that Iran is staring at in terms of the Houthis in Yemen. Not really, I would say, obviously vocally they seem to be very focused on Israel, yet all the ships they hit seem to be Chinese and Russian bound ships carrying Russian oil. When one of our Twitch streamers over here interviewed Houthi, they currently had Chinese sailors as hostages for almost a year. This is not exactly like most of us would go, how do you start a fight in a bar? Go out and kick the taillight of someone you've never met. It makes no sense. Like, if you've got a problem with somebody, you would address that directly, and especially if you're espousing it all the time. If you're calling this person out and then you go punch the bartender for no reason. This seems to be what the Houthis are doing. So it's hard to see if they're a functional fight in there. Syria was a mess. We clearly gave, Trump gave Russia a base of ours. That was the hinge point for the arms from Iran that went to Hezbollah, that flew through that Russian base. So Syria's this kind of opaque hole right now. I don't know that is there any sense of stabilization there? And there's also been this Iranian creep in Iraq that we've been hearing a lot about. Is this also partly in response to pushing them back out of Iraq?
So you mentioned a lot of things here that need to be slowly unpacked here,
sure.
As far as trying to deal with the regional things that are playing out here. So, to start with your first point, the the perception is in the amount of attention that Israel gets as being the navel as far as the crux of all problems in the Middle East, of course, that has to do with a lot of media and propaganda that's involved in the groups that are pushing all of this forward. Notwithstanding, Israel, there are a lot of other problems in the Middle East. And so one needs to tackle all these problems that you started to mention here. What did happen, as a result of the war in Gaza, which is fascinating itself to look at itself as far as, is the collapse of the Assad regime. I mean, the Assad regime was a totalitarian regime. Talk about abuse of people. When Assad, the father, literally murdered millions of people, and then the son did the same thing. I mean, and what people are coming out here now. I am not saying that that Ashar or Julani, as far as his nom de guerre goes, is he's going to change suddenly and become a moderate, though he's trying to sell himself as such. And apropos Trump's visit to the region, when he saw Ashar, during his visit, there's a lot of moving parts here that need to change. And again, apropos our earlier point about Sunnis and Shiites, Julani is a Sunni as far as when it comes, radical. And so did he change all of that? Also unclear, not to mention the fact that, the connection to Turkey. The Turks are watching all of this. Let's not forget the Kurds, that are also part of this feature. I mean, Syria is a manufactured country and is built on a lot of ethnicities for many, many years, but they've been at the juncture point geographically of all of these countries. When you look at the Middle East, when it comes to Lebanon, Syria, and if you go back historically speaking, you can also see great powers being involved in the area, not to mention the French and the British. And we could talk about historically about how the maps in the Middle East were configured as far as where they configured incorrectly. And so what you're seeing now that we are at a point, we are at an inflection point. And I think that, interestingly enough, if you look also at the Druze community inside of Israel, who are, come from Syria. And so there's they're looking at Syria now to see, is there a place to go home back to? Can there be collaboration? Again, unknown. Syria has yet to strike or do anything when it comes to engaging with Israel, because they're trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up and how this is all going to play out. Historically speaking, which is also a feature in all of this, Syria, and this is also critically important. If you had a map here of what's playing out here, with the collapse, if Iran falls apart here and the preemptive, narrative falls apart here, this has to do with a large Shia consecutive line of countries that ended with Syria as far as Iran, in your map there, all the way from Iran to Syria. And so the fact that Syria is now governed literally by Sunnis, the Assad regime and the Alawites were a sect of Shiism. And so that's all collapsing. If Iran is also going to collapse. So you're talking about the collapse of the Shiite axis. And so, and let's not forget that the dominant force of where Shiite forces have been operating, not to mention Shia militias in Iraq, to your map over there, and of course Hezbollah, which is a direct arm of the IRGC and direct arm of the Islamic Republic of Iran altogether. Well, they've all been operating in this area. And so the fact of the matter is, all of these shifts are taking place here. Now, there's a new prime minister in Lebanon, and again, they're trying to do what they can to try to marginalize or move Hezbollah outside of of Lebanon, so Lebanon could try to re-govern itself. But there's a fundamental question for years: is Lebanon able to govern itself without Hezbollah? Hezbollah has hijacked Lebanon and has been hijacking the Lebanese parliament. Now that Hezbollah has been significantly devastated as a result of the pager attack and the leadership and other kind of things, again, there's a sense that these countries are trying to figure out how do we figure out without getting involved in this war. We're going to get pulled in. I mean, imagine, which would have been a plausible scenario, had it been a pager operation when it came to Hezbollah, you would have immediately seen Hezbollah jump on the bandwagon and start, raining down ballistic missiles from Hezbollah into Israel after, Israel attacked Iran. So, I mean, the connectivity here also plays into all of this as well.
Right.
So you got to look at all of these features that are playing out here. The Middle East is evolving and changing. So when you look at the stable countries in the region, which is again talking about the countries that are willing to work together, it's no surprise that the Gulf is turning towards Israel. Israel is a stable country. You're looking at places like Egypt and Jordan. You're looking at places like, Saudi Arabia, because they're all concerned, all of these, countries, about non-state actors taking over their own countries, as we've seen by this practice that has been playing out here. And Syria is, of course, is a quintessential example of all of this. Unclear where Syria is going and whether or not Syria is going to be able to maintain stability. We don't know that. It's too early to know because it's a mess going on in Syria. Not to mention the fact that Russia for years had one base, the Lakia base, where they put all their eggs in that basket, and they were long supporters of the Assad regime. No surprise how Assad was able to get to Russia after he was able to escape. And so there is a fundamental question. And the Russians, from Putin's perspective, going back to the Syrian civil war, he thought that he's the one calling the shots. And when he said the war is over, he figured that that's the war is over.
Right.
And you have that aspect of all of this, not to mention the Turkish aspect, which is again related to the exchange of goods and smuggling and going back and forth, and the war that the Turks have with the Kurds as far as nationalism. And if you take it one step further, what's going on with areas like Azerbaijan. I mean, so the continuation of the trickle down impact to all of this definitely lies here, and they are not all rooted into the Gaza war. The Gaza war has had tentacles going back to the connection to Iran and to the larger patrons.
Right. Do you think that some of the tentacles that have come back are similar to what we've seen in Ukraine, with the idea that Russia was the second biggest army in the world, and yet it's somehow getting its ass handed to it by a much smaller country over time, where they've passed the 1 million casualty mark in the last week? This is something that was supposed to take them a very short time and be fairly easy, and it's become order of magnitude worse than Vietnam for them over this period of time. And their alignment with Iran is obviously a problem that they have right now, because Iran, if it's going to have some sort of an exchange with Israel, it's going to need all of its Shahed drones. It's going to need all of its artillery. It's not going to be the supplier that Russia can count on again. This is a country that was borrowing from the North Koreans for artillery shells not too long ago, which is an absurdity. Is there something to that? What was revealed from the beginning of the Gaza war and the extended that the tendrils that came from it are not only just the actions that it triggered like dominoes, but also a realization that Iran or Hezbollah or the Houthis aren't as well armed or as capable as they were believed, because everybody was afraid of either some lower form of mutual assured destruction on a tactical level, or they just, because Israel is surrounded on all sides by these countries, that they were like, let's talk nice about it, or not call them chicken or call them out for being weak. There was the reason I bring this up is one of the statements, people are still wondering. Nobody really knows for sure what happened to the strategic missiles that Hezbollah supposedly had, that they never really used against Israel in the last war. And the belief was they either went to Russia, Iran wanted them back, or they never existed in the first place. I mean, I guess could it be bringing the lie to Iran's faux strength, that these proxies were also another example of its weakness, not its strength, that they were outsourcing something in this?
Well, I think. Look, I think that Hezbollah's stockpile is real. I mean, let's put it into context. I mean,
sure.
When Hamas started the war against Israel, they had 30,000. All right, rockets as far as that goes. I mean, when you talk about Hezbollah had between 150 and 200. As far as rockets go, I think that where Hezbollah is in a place of disarray at this point because there's no leadership.
Right.
You take out a Hassan Nasrallah who's been governing in Hezbollah for decades now, and the top brass leadership, and all of this is taking place here. There is considerable amount of disarray in all of these organizations. So I'm not sure that it behooves them, as they're trying to organize themselves, to jump on the bandwagon. Though I'm sure there's a great deal of upset by the Iranians trying to push Hezbollah to say,
Right.
You are our friends, you are our direct allies. We expect you to jump into this, head first. And so, I think that there is definitely conversations going on there. And to that end, that's exactly why the Houthis were attacking the Israelis the other day,
Right.
and we had ballistic missiles, because they are indeed taking their marching orders from the Iranians. And so, and I suspect that Iran is trying to activate and mobilize all its allies now. I think that we did see, and then what we see now over the past 3-4 days, we've seen ballistic missiles, we've seen UAVs, we've seen drone attacks. All of that continues coming out of the Iranians. They are a formidable adversary. And again, let's not forget the fact that the majority of the nuclear facilities in Iran are underground. And what the Israelis need now is, and what they're looking for support from the United States. And Israel needs bunker busters and heavy bombs to do all of this activity. While they're targeting questions like areas of Natanz and Ifshahan, Fordo is a big problem, and making sure that actually takes place. And so they can do so much. There has to be also a question of taking it to the next step. And is the United States going to get involved in all of this? And that's what they would like them to help out with here.
Sure.
Again, these are big questions. But I think that as far as Iran, Iran knows how to play the game. They have patience. They have allies. They still have supplies. And I think that they should not be, nobody should underestimate their capabilities. And I don't think the Israelis are. I think, for that matter, and there's no doubt to my mind that they are looking towards, getting these proxies. And there's no doubt, and let's not forget, while this new front has been opened up, relatively new front, the war in Gaza continues. They're still, fighting in Gaza. So all of this stuff continues all along, and everybody's getting involved. And so the question is, whose side are you on? Iran's allies and Iran's patrons are going to stand by Iran. And they are relying on trying to get, or kind of pro-regime forces in Europe and in the United States to say, okay, let's try to calm it down. We'll try to come back to the negotiating table, and let's see how we can fool the West and the Americans again. They rely, or trying to appeal to, Trump's, transactional kind of narrative as far as a deal. But I do think that it has trickled down the fact that this is not really a sustainable aspect here, and there had to be a military option. And we passed that red line. Clearly, we surpassed it. And so I think that that's really what we're looking at now, and the reality that will emerge from this. And that's going to be a totally new, different Middle East.
Yeah.
And where are all these allies going to stand with who, and how that configuration is going to play out.
Yeah. Well, and ASF ROMIROWSKY, I really appreciate you being on in our last 5 minutes together. This seems to be an impossible thing to predict, but I think we can predict some of the actions by some of the players, and namely Israel. It seems to me that they are, for lack of a better phrase, sort of in it to win it. They have recognized, either whether it was post October 7th or the recognition that Trump was seemingly trying to enter into an ill-advised Iranian deal, to try and replace the one that was there, and wasn't really paying attention to the details. This seems to be the reported news on it, that he just wanted to, stack a deal amongst things he was accomplishing early in his term. That it made the Israelis either believe that they were on their own, or they really had to make a big mark on this to set some time where they could be able to, rebuild and reclassify who their friends and their enemies are in the region. Whereas Iran, last Thursday, Yeah, IAEA says they're still enriching uranium and they're not letting us look like they said they would. They're disengaging from the non-proliferation agreements they had made. And that same day, Iran says, not only are we not doing that, we're opening up a new enrichment site on top of that. And sort of to hell with you. The same, within 3 hours, the Israeli strike came. So it seems to be, a very practical response from Israel in this regard, as we focus. And I think the attacks on what they've hit do show that they are trying to hit military targets and military, members of the IRGC very specifically. And the Iranian response was simply to bomb Tel Aviv as a city.
Correct. I mean, so that goes back to the earlier point about, what Israel distinguishes, how the Israelis value life and the Iranians don't, like all their proxies. Mm-hmm. And that report that you mentioned by the IAEA is quite telling. I mean, about the fact that, and they've been out of it for quite some time, but the fact that they're able to produce a report about Iranian enrichment is very clear. I mean, I think that it passed the no-go kind of point here, where you have to make this happen. It is not sustainable. And as we said from the get-go, Israel has been laser focused on this for years. And there was no way that they could live with themselves with that reality. They already, the intelligence that we have today, as far as leaks, that came out, we know that they tried to go to the Trump administration back in November. Trump said, no, let's try to work out some kind of conversations. It got to that point of surpassing the 60 days, and here's where we are. And I think that in the long run, the Middle East will be safer as a result of this. We will be safer as a result of this. It will take time, but Iran was definitely is and still, and has been a threat to the larger stability of the Middle East at large, and also to the West. I mean, let's not forget, it's not contained just to the Middle East.
Right. I do think we write off the death to America stuff as sort of adorably colloquial, because we're safe way over here. And death to Israel must sound very different to you when you're within ballistic missile range. Even in a conventional sense, that it is a very different experience, especially after, the Arab War against Israel and the repeated strikes and something like October 7th, when you can stiff arm this conflict the way we over here in the United States can. Hearing the phrase "death to America" seems almost like a bumper sticker, but they mean it, is I think the key. And the Persians or the Iranian people don't seem to mean it if you see them one-to-one, but the Ayatollah clearly does, the IRGC clearly does, and it's only, they have already said America is on the hook for this, whether we help Israel or not, which seems to give Trump, I guess, permission. Hey, if they're going to hate us no matter what we do, we might as well go through with it. So this may even ironically open the door for him to give them bunker busters or whatever they'll need. Is there somewhere I can send people? Do you have a regular podcast or a show or a website you'd like me to share?
Sure. Our website is spme.org. Scholars for Peace in the Middle East.
Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. Yeah, spme.org. Awesome. Well, thank you for being on here today. I'm sure I have a multitude of history questions that one day perhaps we'll dive into after the fire settles down, if it indeed it ever does, to a slow simmer or an actual cooling. Hope, God willing, it'll find its way to a balance one day. But I really appreciate you being on. These are tough questions to hash through, especially around Syria and Lebanon. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for the hospitality. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We'll have you on again if you can stand it. There we go. So thank you so much. Off he goes. Appreciate it, sir. Thank you. Asif ROMIROWSKY, and Dr. CHIC Canfora is in the you still have your camera open, and I'm just saying, all I'm seeing is a wall, but I maybe you're just listening to the show, but I'm just saying hello. Her camera's still. I didn't want to hang up because I'm like, oh, maybe she's just watching the show via the stream that she gets in there or whatever. Chat room, I didn't get a chance to bring you guys in because we jumped straight into all this, and there was so much to cover. Really great show today, I feel like. Covered a lot of stuff. Holy smoke. Oh, yes, she did jump back in. Hold on. Hold on. I'm going to turn... I muted you because I didn't want to listen in on what you were doing. That would be rude. Whoops, hold on. Back here. Hold on. There we go. Hi. So
Hi, that's okay. I've been running around doing stuff ever since I jumped off, but I wanted to hear the interview, so I stayed on. I just kept it
awesome.
on.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you, and we'll have you on again. Like I said, it would be my honor if you would sometime.
Okay.
So,
Well,
all
it's
right,
great to meet you, and I really enjoyed the rest of the show. That's why I didn't shut it off. I
nice.
didn't know how to get back on. So,
That's great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We'll see you again. All right.
hey,
Cheers.
how
And
bye.
that, yeah. Bye. And you're yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because I was like, I could still see her living room. I feel kind of bad, but at the same time, I don't want to like, you know, shut her off from that. So let's go back to the chat room. Hi, chat room. You guys are wonderful. If I may, let me grab over here. Open this window project. There we go. So a lot to unpack, obviously, and a lot of news to cover today. Obviously, I'll be back on this afternoon. I do feel like because we were so interview heavy, I do want to address a couple of things before we get into this. Like stories that kind of popped up over the weekend that we didn't really get to address, you know, one-to-one. Here's one of the things I wanted to show you guys, which this kind of ties into what we were just talking about with ASF. But this Marjorie Taylor Greene blasts disgusting MAGA hawks in new civil war. So she's mad that that Trump is thinking about supporting Israel in this situation. Now, wouldn't it be lovely if Marjorie Taylor Greene was suddenly a peacenik who worried about innocent civilian lives? You're adorable. This is entirely to do with the fact that Iran is Russia's buddy. And if Iran is caught in a real dust-up with Israel, then Russia can't get Shahed drones and can't get artillery shells and all kinds of computer gear and black market chips that they get from China through Iran. That's why she gives a shit. She's mad because the very same Russia that supplied money to Republicans via the NRA by shuffling, unchecked dark money through the NRA into all kinds of congressional districts, is in danger of having that gravy train derailed. That's why. Another story, real quick. ICE is running out of money. So one of the things that Trump likes to talk about, we didn't need legislation. We just needed a new president. Remember that? Because Biden was asking for actual funding for an actual program, because that's actually how stuff, functions. And as we know, Donald Trump has no idea how anything works.
That's not how it works. You got it all wrong.
You gotta pay for it, asshole.
Losing game.
That's right.
So let's
It's a new episode of
play along.
That's Not How It Works. Wait, hold on.
Welcome to That's Not How It Works with your host, HAL Sparks.
All right. Now, this is the problem they find themselves in. So you do need legislation. You do need Congress that controls the purse strings to pay for this shit. And if you don't, you have to borrow it from emergency services and all kinds of other stuff, which if you live in North Carolina right now, welcome to why you're fucked. That's exactly why. Because Donald Trump can't get any legislation passed to pay for any of this shit. The House doesn't know what the fuck it's doing. The Senate is afraid of what the House is doing, and and there's so much infighting that they can't even pass a regular funding bill about their priorities that they allegedly got a landslide victory on. If there's anything that Trump won on, it was allegedly immigration, right? But they can't pass funding for it because they suck. But also because they just don't understand how shit works. And they're running out of cash. The Trump's big, beautiful bill is supposed to give $75 billion to ICE over the next 5 years, but they're burning through money like crazy. Now, he has to declare another national emergency to redirect money to ICE from elsewhere in the government, similar to what he did in 2020 to divert nearly $4 billion in Pentagon funds to his border wall. This is Biden was right. You got to pass a bill. You want to pay for this shit? You want to make a bunch of National Guard people or hire a bunch of CPB people to stand in the fucking sand near a wall that you build and extend that out? You got to pay for it. Where do you have to pay for it? Well, you got to put it in a budget someplace, or you got to pass a singular piece of legislation where you allocate those funds from revenue or borrowing to actually do it. You got to call for a bond issuance on it, or you got to actually fucking take tax money that goes one place and like interest on the debt and put it here. That's what you have to do. Biden was right. Trump is wrong. This is, I mean, again, but, the House is abdicating all of its responsibility to actually control those purse strings because they're scared shitless of this dickhead, and so they panic. All right, so there's another story. I'm just hitting you up with a few before I let you go on the end of it. I want to, let's see. I want to find the actual number I was looking at before, because I was reading an article this morning and I had one of those moments. I try not to read articles in bed when I first wake up because I will sometimes utter out of nowhere, those motherfuckers. That just happens. I'm just letting you know. And I think I might have it on, I know I have it on my phone because I was reading it there before. That's kind of stuff. Doobity-doo. This one I'm guessing. Yes. Here it is. So good. Some of this, kids, remember, I mean, really. All right, let me open this up. There you go. Put this in here. Thank you. And boop, there it is. Okay. In a story called, well, here, I'll put it on Reader so I can show you this thing. Immigration crackdown fears hit white-collar offices because for many reasons. Some people were legal yesterday and they're not today because Donald Trump just zeroed out without telling anybody their work visa or their work authorization that they'd been working at companies, and all of a sudden they're illegals all of a sudden, right? They go from legal to illegal. Now, and people are afraid to come into work, and just when they're trying to get people to work back in the office, oh dear, oh dear. So, for first time in 20 years of advising white-collar employers on immigration law, clients are asking, what do we do if there's an ICE raid? Her typical clients employ those at least at the bachelor's degree in professional fields such as IT and medicine. So you're really talking about visa overstays more than you're talking about nobody. We don't have any like biologists or in theory, or science assistants sneaking across the southern border, right? And these are also people from Ukraine or Afghanistan who he has revoked, who were here because they either helped us in the Afghanistan war or they are allies in Ukraine and they're just some shit about it. Venezuela, obviously, Trump gave everybody deferred action on his last day in his first term so that they could stick around. And now he wants to kick them all out of the country because how did they get here? And then, of course, Haiti, because black people, I think, largely, that's his concern, obviously. Now, here's the thing. I have been saying for quite some time, and you guys know it, I have been hammering this, that there are by no means 25 million people. There were not 10 million people that came across during the Biden years. There were not 5 million gotaways or 8 million gotaways. All that was horseshit, and that our number has really never gotten ever above 11.5. Even at its peak, even when listen to me, Reagan did, his like amnesty, period, his amnesty phase. The number was about 11. It was topping out at 11 million. It was under it. But 11.5, 11.6 being the top number, close to the beginning of, or the late part of the Trump era, before the Trump first term, before COVID happened. Now, you guys see that? See that number? They may think he got rid of 16 million people in the last 5 months. Anybody think that? Anybody oh, thank you so much for the gifted memberships. thank you guys for your support. I didn't ask for it today, and I should, because Venmo and Patreon and all that kind of stuff, and it helps. But I get too busy doing the show to sell the show. So that's why other shows have commercials, because all right. Anyways, point being, there are about 8.5 million undocumented workers in the U.S., according to an estimate soon to be published, provided by Matthew Lezecki, Senior Research and Policy Analyst for the Center for Migration Studies. There's a fairly high share of undocumented workers in fast-growing occupations like data scientists and software developers. I mean, it was bound to happen anyways. It's like homeless people with cell phones. That became a thing. You know what I mean? Like, there was a point where, if everybody, like, they'd have to bump change to use a payphone, and now they're borrowing Wi-Fi from Starbucks, right? That's just the future. That's how it works. Watch Ready Player One. You'll get where some of this is going. That's what I wanted to point out to everyone. Not only are we nowhere near 25 million or 20 million or 22 million illegals in the country, there's only 8.5 million undocumented workers in the country, and the idea that they all have families of 4 and that one of the spouses is a stay-home spouse is ridiculous. And Trump can't go, well, we got rid of it. Fantastic. We were able to broom these folks. There weren't flights and buses leaving on that level. There's never been a 4 million person, exodus from the United States at any given point since Trump was elected the first time, when people were like, I'm going to Europe, see you in 4 years. 8.5. I have said this, and I have said this many, many times, that number was not only meant to gin up fear and scare people and stuff, but it was fiction to start with. And it still is. And the same thing goes, by the way, for the tariff revenue. We're bringing in billions in revenue, yes, and we're losing trillions in income. Like, it's like the GDP is losing trillions while we bring in billions in revenue. And again, I can understand why that would sound like a lot if you're talking to somebody in Kentucky, where I'm originally from, or if you've been as broke as Trump has been, living off his family tit his whole life. $1 billion or $10 billion or $15 billion or $5 billion a day sounds like holy shit. But if you have a $27 trillion economy and you've shaved off $2 trillion trying to get billions a day, it reminds me of that old Steve Martin. He goes, I'm the writer of the book, How I Turned $1 million in Real Estate into $12.50 in cash, or whatever. I'm just saying, I'm very proud of the fact that I don't waste your guys' time. I'm very proud of the fact that, with rare exception, I think I'm only batting 2 out of 100, or 98 out of 100. I'm right. That when I'm calling this stuff, the oil glut thing is the same thing's going to happen, even with in any other normal circumstance, with Israel firing missiles at Iran, you would clearly see a rise in oil prices approaching $100 right out of the gate. If this was the 90s or the early 2000s, like happened around 9/11, you'd see this amazing jack up, and you're like, oh shit, everything's off the table. Like, this is going to be bad. But namely, there's so much oil in circulation, you could almost make an argument, and I don't know that I'm ready to do that yet, and I'm going to send you guys off thinking about this. You could almost make an argument that the Saudis were expecting the Israelis to attack, and that's part of the reason why OPEC Plus started to increase their output. I think it's largely because the poorer countries in OPEC Plus couldn't wait. But there's, maybe they said, hey guys, we're going to do this, so perhaps, maybe, they were like, let's make plenty of oil out there so that when, Israel does what we're all too afraid to do to Iran, the oil prices won't go up too terrible and America won't get mad at us or expect us to do it on the cheap too much. So there you go. Does it always do that? The war, I'm checking on these things. How to become a millionaire: start with $1 million and buy an airline. Right. Start with $1 billion and buy an airline. Right. Okay. So that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it for the time being. You guys are awesome. I'm going to the gym. I'll see you later this afternoon for HAL Sparks Mega Worldwide. Like, subscribe, share the show, etc., etc., etc. I feel like after a show like today, I should do an AMA, right? Maybe that's what I'll do. Like, because I feel bad doing the I don't feel bad, but it feels weird doing the super chat goals, but I don't have anything to add to it because I don't hide anything. Maybe I'll just do it. Like, you guys can make me do a half-hour AMA after a show, something like that. Maybe that's what we do. That would work. I'm cool with that. Okay. Whew. Wish me luck. And thanks to everybody who came out to the show this weekend. It was so fun. You guys were awesome. Sorry, I don't know why my credits aren't rolling right now, guys. I appreciate all the help today. I don't know what's wrong with them, so I will try and remedy them later. Thank you so much.